Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. The steady hum of suburban life had dealt my senses over the years. The streets of our neighborhood were lined with well-kept houses, lawns trimmed to perfection, and faces that never changed. My husband, Derek, was part of that landscape, sturdy and set in his ways, his worldview as orderly as the rows of shrubs he pruned each weekend. He was the type to say he liked things how they used to be and had no patience for what he called big city antics. It was on a warm afternoon when I first noticed the moving truck next door. It wasn't the kind of moving day you'd expect in our part of town. No quiet unloading, no polite introductions. Instead, laughter and music spilled out into the street as boxes and furniture were carried inside by men dressed in bright colors and easy smiles. I felt a rush of curiosity and stood at the window, pretending to adjust the curtain as I watched them work. And then I saw him, tall, black, and broad-shouldered, with a walk that exuded confidence. He just looked like what a man should look like. He stood out against the neat backdrop of our street, bringing life to the ordinary. I felt my heart skip, an unfamiliar flutter that had been absent for far too long. Derek came home that evening, saw the truck and frowned. Figures, he muttered. Always loud, always a mess. I felt a pain in my chest, but I didn't say anything. That night, as Derek ranted about everything from city folk moving in to how they'd lower property values, I wondered for the first time if his grumbling was more than just frustration. I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was just Derek being set in his ways. The next day, as I watered the garden, I saw our new neighbor, for the first time up close. He was carrying a box across his yard when he caught my eye and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up his face. I blinked, caught off guard. "Hey there," he said, setting the box down and wiping his brow. "You must be my neighbor." "Yes, I'm Anna," I replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. My voice sounded small compared to his deep, easy tone. "Jay," he said, nodding. "Good to meet you, Anna." I opened my mouth to say something else, but Derek's car pulled into the driveway and the smile dropped from my face. I could almost feel the tension crackle between the three of us. Derek's eyes darted to Jay, narrowed with a look that made my stomach twist. Jay didn't seem fazed. He gave a polite nod before turning back to his boxes. Derek waited until Jay was out of earshot before muttering, "Great. Just what we needed. Derek, he's our neighbor. We should at least try to be friendly," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew he wouldn't listen. "I know his type, Anna," he said, brushing past me into the house. The door shut behind him, leaving me outside with a sinking realization that Derek's words weren't just frustration, they were something deeper. The next few days, I found myself watching Jay from my window more often than I'd admit. He was always outside, talking with friends or working on his car. There was something lively about him, something that made my quiet mornings feel even quieter. Then one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Jay standing there, holding a small stack of mail. "Hey, this got mixed in with mine," he said, holding it out to me. "Oh, thank you," I said, taking the envelopes. Our hands brushed, and I felt a jolt run through me. His eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than necessary, and then he smiled. "Guess we're officially neighbors now," he joked. I laughed, a sound that felt foreign to my ears. "Yes, I guess so." From that day on, I noticed the way my heart quickened when I saw him, and I found excuses to be outside. I wore my nicer dresses, once I hadn't touched in years, and applied a touch of lipstick before stepping out. I told myself it was silly, that I was just bored. But the way Jay's eyes lingered on me, when he thought I wasn't looking, said something else. One afternoon, as we chatted by the fence, Jay's expression shifted. I got to ask, "Does your husband have a problem with me?" he said, his voice light but serious. I swallowed, glancing toward the house. "Derek is old school. He didn't grow up around many black people," I said carefully. "Don't take it personally." Jay's smile returned, though softer. "I won't, but thanks for saying that. It is what it is, you know." I felt a rush of guilt, mixed with something else. "I'll make it up to you," I blurted, before I could stop myself. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't press for more. Then one night, I noticed a sleek car parked in Jay's driveway and heard the sound of laughter drifting through his open window. I couldn't see much, just a silhouette of him, and a woman whose laugh was too carefree, too familiar. A strange ache settled in my chest. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, watching shadows move behind Jay's curtains. It was then I realized just how deep I'd fallen. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long beams of light across the tiled floor. I stood at the counter, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee, while watching Jay across the yard. He was leaning over the hood of his car, muscles taut, as he worked on something out of sight. The sight made my pulse quick, and in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't hear Derek come into the kitchen until he muttered something under his breath. "Looks like he's got nothing better to do than show off," he said, eyes narrowing at Jay. He set his briefcase down with a thud and poured himself coffee, ignoring me entirely. I bit my tongue, the familiar routine of his judgment making my chest tighten. Once he left for work, the house felt bigger, quieter, almost suffocating in its silence. I glanced back at Jay and decided that today I'd take a risk. I pulled on a summer dress that fit snug around my waist and flared out just above my knees. The neckline dipped lower than I usually wore, but the reflection staring back at me looked alive, almost daring. It was time to stop pretending this was anything less than what it was. As I stepped outside, Jay glanced up and smirked, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. "Morning, Anna," he called. "Morning," I said, crossing the yard until the wooden fence was the only thing separating us. My heart pounded as I leaned over the edge. "Working on your car again?" He chuckled, the sound deep and rich. "Yeah, she's temperamental. Needs a lot of attention." "Sounds familiar," I said, surprising myself at the flirtatious edge in my voice. His eyes flashed with amusement as he looked up, the moment stretching between us. "So, what's your story?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You move here from the city?" Jay paused, a shadow crossing his face, before he nodded. "Yeah, something like that," he said, his voice quieter. He met my eyes, and there was something deeper there, something that made my breath catch. He sat down the rag and walked over to where I stood, leaning against the fence, into his away. "I haven't been completely honest," he admitted, his gaze steady. "I just got out of prison a few months ago." The confession should have made me step back, made me nervous. Instead, I felt a strange, electric thrill shoot through me. I held his gaze, searching for fear or regret in myself, and finding none. "Why tell me now?" I whispered. "Because I can see it in your eyes, Anna. You're looking for something more, something real," he said, his voice low.
"And I'm tired of pretending to be something I'm not." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until he reached out, brushing his stray hair from my cheek. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "I should go," I said, though I made no move to leave. "You should," he echoed, but neither of us moved. The silence between us was thick, charged with unspoken words and desires I hadn't dared voice in years. "Come inside," he said, stepping back and opening the side gate that led to his house. I looked over my shoulder at my empty home, the drawn curtains, the rooms that held too many memories but too few sparks. Before I could think, I stepped through the gate, letting it close behind me with a soft click. The air inside his house was warmer, filled with the scent of him, clean, slightly musky, with a hint of something sharp like cologne. Jay's eyes darkened as he reached for my hand, pulling me close. His touch was firmer now, urgent, and I matched his intensity without hesitation. When his lips met mine, the world outside blurred until there was nothing left but the rush of my pulse and the heat that spread through me. Time slipped away as we moved together, a dance that felt both reckless and freeing. The afternoon sun shifted shadows on the wall, and I didn't think of Derek, didn't think of what would come next. I only thought of Jay, the way he looked at me like I was the only real thing in the room. Hours later, I sat on the edge of his bed, the sheets tangled around me. Jay lay beside me, propped up on one elbow, tracing lazy circles on my back. "I'm not sorry," I said, more to myself than to him. The words felt like a confession, raw and honest. "Good," he said, his voice soft. "'Cause I'm not either." I glanced at the clock and realized how late it was. Derek would be home in less than an hour. I stood, gathering my clothes, feeling Jay's eyes on me as I dressed. "When can I see you again?" he asked, his tone playful but serious. "Soon," I promised. The weight of what we'd done settled over me like the secret that I wasn't ready to let go of. As I stepped back into my own house, the silence felt different, less oppressive. I looked at the pictures on the mantel, the ones of Derek and me on our wedding day, smiling as if the world would never touch us. But that world felt distant now, and I didn't feel guilty. For the first time in years I felt awake. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of my life shifted. Mornings were for Derek, who left early for work, never noticing the way my heart raced when I heard his car pull out of the driveway. Afternoons were for Jay. We kept up the pretense, waiting casually over the fence, exchanging pleasantries, as if everything was the same. But when the world wasn't looking, we were different. We shared whispers and stolen moments that made my skin tingle. One warm evening, Derek sat at the dinner table, reading the newspaper. He sipped his drink, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I could feel the weight of what I was doing pressing against the silence between us, but it didn't feel like a burden. Felt like freedom. "I heard there was a lot of noise coming from next door the other night," Derek said suddenly, breaking the quiet. My heart skipped a beat. "Oh." "I didn't hear anything," I lied, remembering how I'd seen Jay with a group of friends on his porch, laughter floating into the night air. Derek coughed, folding the paper. "Of course she didn't. They're always loud. Now respect for anyone else." I pressed my lips together, my gaze drifting to the window. I could see Jay's house from where I sat, lights glowing warmly inside. Part of me wanted to defend him, tell Derek that he was wrong, that Jay was more respectful than most of the people we'd known in this neighborhood. But I stayed silent, feeling a strange guilt, mixed with defiance. After dinner, I stood at the sink washing dishes, lost in thought, when the faint sound of music caught my attention. I looked up the window and saw Jay's silhouette moving across the room, the outline of another figure beside him. A woman's laugh rang out, soft and teasing. My chest tightened with something unfamiliar, sharp and unsettling. Jealousy. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Not with Derek, not with anyone. I felt my hands go still in the soapy water, as I watched the shadows dance together. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Jay wasn't mine to feel possessive over, and yet the nod in my stomach said otherwise. I dried my hands and sat on the edge of the couch, pretending to read while Derek watched TV, but my mind was across the yard. Each time I heard laughter or the clink of glasses, it made my heart pound a little harder. By the time Derek had turned off the TV and gone to bed, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool air prickling my skin. Jay's laughter reached me, and I felt a pain that was half longing, half irritation. I crossed the lawn, my bare feet brushing the grass, and knocked softly on his door. The noise inside stilled for a moment, and then the door opened. Jay's widened in surprise, a smile pulling at his lips. "Anna, didn't expect to see you here." "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice trembling with more than just the chill of the night. He glanced over his shoulder, and I caught a glimpse of the woman, a striking figure with curly hair and a competent stance. She raised an eyebrow at me before turning away, uninterested. Jay stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What's going on?" he asked, folding his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. I felt foolish now, standing there in my thin nightgown, shivering under his gaze. "I just heard the noise and wanted to check if everything was okay," I said, the light tasting bitter on my tongue. Jay's eyes softened as he watched me, and I knew he saw right through it. He reached out, his fingers brushing my arm. "You don't need to worry about me, Anna." I looked up at him, the space between us charged. "Maybe I just wanted to," I whispered. The silence stretched, and then, without another word, he opened the door wider, nodding for me to come inside. The woman from earlier had already left, a forgotten presence in the corner of my mind, as Jay closed the door behind us. We stood in the small living room, the sound of the city, drifting through the open window. He moved closer, his expression unreadable as he took my face in his hands, tilting it up so our eyes met. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "Yes," I said, the word coming out with more certainty than I felt. But when his lips met mine, there was no doubt. Everything fell away, the guilt, the fear, the ache of wanting. There was only us, and the heat that sparked between us was undeniable. When I left his house that night, the sky had already started to lighten with the promise of dawn. I crossed the yard quietly, slipping back into my house before Derek woke. I stood in the hallway, feeling the lingering warmth of Jay's touch, and I knew that whatever this was, I didn't regret it. Not one bit. The days that followed were a blur of secret smiles and hidden touches. Jay and I were careful, keeping our moments brief but intense. Derek, as always, stayed oblivious, too wrapped up in his routine to notice the subtle shift in me. Then one afternoon everything changed. Derek came home early, earlier than I'd ever expected. I was in Jay's living room, laughter spilling from my lips as he teased me about the way I mispronounced certain words. The front door burst open, and there stood Derek, eyes wide with disbelief and rage. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the small room. Before I could react, Derek lunged forward, fists clenched. But Jay stepped in front of me, holding his ground. Derek swung wildly, but Jay caught his arm, twisting it just enough to stop him without causing harm. Derek struggled, cursing, but Jay's grip held firm. "Stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Please stop." Derek's eyes met mine, full of betrayal and something darker. Jay released him, stepping back, hands raised in surrender. "I don't want to hurt you," Jay said calmly, his voice steady. Derek's chest, he glared at both of us, the realization settling between us like a weight. I stood frozen, the room spinning as I watched my husband's rage turn to something cold and final. Derek's eyes darted between me and Jay, disbelief, giving way to a look that made my stomach twist. It was the kind of look that said everything without a word, a realization settling in that this wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. It was betrayal. "Get out," Derek said, his voice low and trembling with barely controlled fury. I could see the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the veins on his neck pulsing. Jay stood tall, his face impassive, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. He didn't move, and neither did I. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until Derek shouted again, louder this time, "Get out of my house." "It's not your house," Jay said quietly, his eyes narrowing. "We're in mine." That statement seemed to snap something inside Derek. He looked around as if just realizing where he was, the pictures on Jay's walls, the mismatched furniture that had become familiar to me over these past weeks. His face darkened, and his gaze fell back on me, eyes blazing. "Anna," he said, his voice cracking. "You need to come with me." I stood frozen, my heart thundering in my chest. My feet felt rooted to the spot, torn between the man I had promised my life to, and the one who had shown me something I didn't know I was missing. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it was enough. Derek's eyes widened and shocked, the disbelief clear on his face. "No." He echoed, as if the word was foreign, something he couldn't grasp. Jay stepped closer to me, his presence solid and reassuring. "I think it's best if you go, Derek," he said, his tone firm but not aggressive. Derek looked at Jay, his rage simmering just beneath the surface. "You think you can just take what's mine? You think you can just waltz in here?" And he cut himself off, his fists tightening. For a moment, I thought he would try to fight again, but he took a step back, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control. "This isn't over," he spat, glaring at me one last time before turning on his heel and storming out. The front door slammed shut behind him, the sound vibrating through my body like an aftershock. The silence that followed was deafening. I reached for my hand, his touch gentle, grounding me in the moment. "Are you okay?" he asked, searching my face for answers. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. The reality of what just happened started to sink in, but so did the certainty that I couldn't go back. Not to the way things were, not to Derek, not to pretending. Jay wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. "We'll figure this out," he said, his breath warm against my hair. The words were simple, but they carried a promise that settled the chaos inside me. The next few hours passed in a blur. I stayed at Jay's, afraid to go home, afraid to face whatever came next. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Derek, each one angrier than the last. But I couldn't bring myself to answer. It wasn't until the sky turned dark that I realized the full weight of what had happened. I was sitting on Jay's couch, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls when he joined me, a quiet strength in the way he moved. "What are you going to do?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I took a deep breath, the question I'd been avoiding now unavoidable. "I don't know," I admitted. The thought of facing Derek, the reality of what this meant for our marriage, felt overwhelming. But then I looked at Jay, the man who had shown me a side of life that was raw and real, and I knew that whatever came next, I couldn't pretend anymore. "Stay here tonight," Jay said softly. It wasn't a question but an offer, one I wanted to take. "Okay," I whispered, leaning into him as the weight of the day settled over me. The hour slipped by uncomfortable silence, the kind where words weren't needed. And as I lay next to Jay, my head resting against his chest, I knew that while everything outside this room felt uncertain, this moment was the only thing that made sense. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. The soft powder was soothing, a temporary balm for the storm brewing in my life. Jay was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, deep in thought. When he noticed I was awake, he gave me a small, reassuring smile. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Morning." I sat up, wrapping the blanket around me. "I should go back. Face him." Jay's jaw tensed, but he nodded. "Do you want me to come with you?" I shook my head. "I need to do this alone." The thought of seeing Derek again made my heart race, but I knew it was time. The walk back to my house felt longer than usual. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and when I pushed open the door, the silence was suffocating. The living room looked the same as it had the day before, but everything felt different. Derek was sitting on the couch, his eyes bloodshot and tired. He looked up when I entered, the tension in the room palpable. "Anna," he said, his voice rough. There was no anger now, just exhaustion. "We need to talk." I nodded, closing the door behind me, ready for whatever came next. Derek sat on the edge of the couch, the tension in the room so thick, it felt hard to breathe. I stood just inside the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, but I forced myself to look at him. "Anna," he began, his voice strained. "I don't even know where to start. What were you thinking?" I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling the sting of guilt mix with defiance. "I was thinking that I needed something real, Derek. Something I haven't felt in a long time." His eyes narrowed, disbelief clouding his face. "With him. With that man." He spat out the word like it burned him, and something in me snapped. "Stop it," I said sharply, stepping forward. "Stop talking about him like that. Like he's less than you. You've done nothing but judge him since the moment he moved in." "Why?" "Because he doesn't fit into your picture of what's acceptable." Derek's face flushed red. "You don't get it, Anna. People like him. People like him." I interrupted, my voice trembling with anger. "Do you hear yourself? Do you know how racist that is? How disgusting it is, that you think you're better than someone just because they don't look or act like you?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, Derek looked genuinely stunned, as if he'd been hit with a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. "I realized something last night," I continued, my voice softer now, but no less certain. "I never really loved you. Not in the way that matters. I loved the idea of us, the comfort and the stability. But you showed me who you really are, and I can't unsee that." Derek's eyes widened, the shock giving way to a deep, wounded expression. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice cracking. I do, I said, holding his gaze. And I'm done pretending. I'm done ignoring the way you treat people who don't fit your mold. I'm done with this marriage. Silence settled between us, heavy and final. I could see the hurt in his eyes, but it didn't make me falter. I felt like I was seeing things clearly for the first time. Derek stood abruptly, his fists clenching at his sides. So that's it. You're leaving me for him. For some ex-con. He's more of a man than you'll ever be, I said, my voice low but steady. And yes, he's been through things you couldn't even imagine, but he's kind. He's real. He doesn't look down on people for where they come from. Derek's face darkened, and without another word, he stormed past me, grabbing his phone from the table. I watched a sense of dread pooling in my stomach as he dialed a number. What are you doing? I asked, my voice tight. He didn't answer until I heard the voice on the other end. Yes, I'd like to report a parole violation, he said coldly, locking eyes with me as he spoke. The man's name is Jay Williams. Yes, the address is. Well. I lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but Derek shoved me back with more force than I expected. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the table as he rattled off the details. The call was quick, and when he hung up, a smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Let's see how much he means to you when he's behind bars again, he said bitterly. My heart sank as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I ran to the window, watching helplessly as police cars pulled up in front of Jay's house. The officers knocked, and Jay stepped outside. His expression calmed, but resigned as they cuffed him. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, a look of apology and understanding passing between us. Tears blurred my vision as I turned back to Derek. You ruined everything, I said, my voice breaking. But I'm not staying here, not for another second. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, not caring about Derek's shouts behind me. By the time I reached the police station, my mind was set. I would fight for Jay, for what we had, and I wouldn't let Derek's fight win. Hours passed, filled with paperwork, questions, and the overwhelming weight of reality. But eventually I stood in the lobby, waiting as Jay was let out. He looked tired but relieved when he saw me. You didn't have to do this, he said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Yes, I did, I said, reaching for his hand. And I'll keep doing it as long as it takes. He squeezed my hand, a promise shared without words. As we walked out into the early morning light, I felt the first stirrings of hope. The road ahead would be complicated, messy, and uncertain, but it was ours. And that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.